Meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 130 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance, and pursuant to Standing Order 108 Bracket 2, the committee is meeting to discuss only parts 1 to 4 of the subject matter of Bill C-59, an act to implement certain provisions of the Fall Economic Statement, tabled in Parliament on November 21st, 2023, and certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 28, 2023. Part 5 will be studied at a future meeting of the committee. So just for members' sake, parts 1 to 4 today, part 5 at a future meeting. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the Standing Order 15.1. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the members. Although this room is equipped with a powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to a microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on, in order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of the interpreters. I invite participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged in, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. So now I'd like to welcome our witnesses today for the study of the subject matter of Bill C-59, an act to implement certain provisions of the Fall Economic Statement tabled in Parliament on November 21st, 2023, and certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 28th, 2023. So we have a number of officials from the Department of Finance with us that are joining us. Please note that all of these individuals will not be able to sit at the table, and if questions arise for those individuals that are not at the table, they will be called and we'll exchange seats with those that are at the table to answer those questions. I request all officials to clearly state their name and department before answering a question, please. Now, at the table, we do have a few individuals that will give us some opening remarks, and those will be to the different parts that we will be looking into today. We have Lindsay Guire. She'll be addressing part 1. James Green will be addressing part 2, and Amanda Riddle parts 3 and 4. So we are so we have many.
Just hopefully a brief point of order, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
And I do apologize to the witnesses, but I think it's important we get a little bit of business done at the outset.
Okay. Well, it's not right now. We are allowing our witnesses to make their opening remarks. So the witnesses are going to make their opening remarks, and just also to know that we have many officials with us today, and we thank you all for being with us. And you'll see them seated in the back, and they will be able to address questions also if they pertain to their departments. So on that, I'm going to open it up and allow our officials to start. I guess Ms. Lindsay Guire, you'll start with part 1, please.
Mr. Chair, point of order.
Lindsay,
point of order.
please.
Mr.
Ms.
Chair,
Guire.
you have an obligation to recognize.
Ms. Guire will start with opening
Mr.
remarks.
Chair, you have an obligation. Please do not crosstalk. You're hurting the interpreters, Mr. Chair.
We're allowing Ms. Guire to commence. Yes, Ms. Guire, you may commence.
Point of order. You have an obligation.
What is the point of order? Yes, point of order. Point of order.
You have an obligation to recognize a point of order, Mr. Chair.
Point of order, I do, yes.
Do I need to quote the rules?
Yeah, point of order, yes.
So, point of order. With respect to the motion that was passed earlier in this committee, it was noted that within the next meeting following the beginning of the pre-study, we would have Chrystia Freeland, the Minister of Finance. Could you please confirm that Ms. Freeland will be here for the next meeting?
Well, we don't have our PS here. I would look to the PS, but we will look to check on that for you. Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
I'll have more to say in my
Thank
question
you.
period. Thank you.
Thank you. MP Lawrence. Okay. And Ms. Guire, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm Lindsay Guire, Director of General Legislation at the Department of Finance. So I'm here to talk about Part 1. A number of my colleagues are also here to answer questions on Part 1. So Part 1 contains the income tax measures in the bill. There's about 20 measures, so I won't be able to describe them all, but I'll just do a very high-level summary of several of the key ones. So first, there's a number of integrity measures in Part 1. The first two relate to recommendations from the OECD's Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project. So the first would limit the deductibility of net interest and financing expenses by certain corporations and trusts to a fixed ratio, which in most cases would be equal to 30% of tax EBITDA. The second OECD-related measure would implement rules to deal with hybrid mismatch arrangements, which are cross-border tax avoidance structures that exploit differences in income tax laws between two countries. D'autres mesures d'intégrité dans le projet.
Other integrity measures in the legislation include an anti-avoidance rule to prevent private companies from avoiding reimbursable taxes on passive revenue, and new rules to facilitate real intergenerational transfers. Those are the rules that have to do with Bill C-208. A change regarding the dividends regarding to Canadian incentives on some shares that are held as property at a market value, and changes to enhance the general rule for anti-avoidance. Moreover, the bill will place a 2% fee on capital that is from trusts and Canadian companies. The interpreter would point out that the interpreters have not received a copy of the text in advance.
Of incentives and changes to tax credits. So first, there's two new refundable investment tax credits. The first would be available to taxable Canadian corporations on investments in eligible equipment used in carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects. And the second is another refundable credit available to taxable Canadian corporations and real estate investment trusts for investments in certain clean technology. Other incentives and credits in Part 1 of the bill include changes to the flow-through share rules to allow expenditures incurred in the exploration and development of all forms of lithium to qualify for the critical mineral exploration tax credit. Changes to extend the phase-out by 3 years and to expand eligible activities for the reduced tax rates for zero technology emission manufacturers. And changes to facilitate the creation of employee ownership trusts. Part 1 would also double the rural supplement for the Canada carbon rebate tax credit. So those are the major measures in Part 1. There's also a number of other more technical measures, so my colleagues and I would be happy to provide more detail on those or any of the measures I mentioned.
Thank you, Ms. Guire. And now we'll hear from Mr. James Green on Part 2.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Part 2 of the bill would enact the digital services tax.
Point of order. The bells are ringing.
The bells are ringing, yes. So I guess we will ask for unanimous consent, as we've done in the past, to see if members are open to that so that we can continue with our witnesses.
I apologize to our witnesses, but no UC.
Okay, so we will suspend. from the top, Mr. James Green, please, on part 2. Yep.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning again. Part 2 of the bill would enact the Digital Services Tax Act. Le Canada préfère une approche multilatérale.
Canada favours a multilateral approach to digital taxation and has been engaged in discussions at the OECD since 2017. The government announced the Digital Services Tax, or DST, in November 2020 as an interim measure, pending a multilateral approach. In October 2021, countries without DSTs, such as Canada, agreed not to impose new DSTs during the negotiations before late 2023. Countries with pre-2022 digital sales taxes, such as France, the UK and Italy, have continued to collect their DSTs.
Announced in 2021 that if a multilateral treaty was not enforced by the end of 2023, the DST would be imposed for 2024. Today, negotiations to finalize a treaty continue. Therefore, the government is proposing this legislation. It was released in draft in December 2021 and again in August 2023, so businesses have known what to expect. The DST is a 3% annual tax on revenue from certain digital services. It would apply to large firms with global revenue of at least 750 million euros and digital services revenue linked to Canadian users of at least $20 million. The tax focuses on digital services in which data and content from Canadian users are a key input and value driver. Specifically, online marketplaces, online targeted advertising, and social media. It would apply equally to Canadian and foreign-owned businesses. It would come into effect on a day set by Ordering Council on or after January 1, 2024. And as announced in 2021, the first year would cover revenues back to January 1, 2022. Meanwhile, the government continues to engage with our international partners. Thank you.
And now we'll go to Ms. Amanda Riddle for parts 3 and 4, please.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Amanda Riddell. I'm the Director of the Real Property and Financial Institutions section in the Sales Tax Division at Finance Canada. I'll briefly describe some of the measures in parts 3 and 4 of the bill, just to give you a flavor of the sales tax measures that are in there. So Part 3 includes amendments to the Excise Tax Act, and Part 4 includes amendments to the Excise Act 2001. The amendments in Part 3 and 4 are technical amendments that affect limited stakeholders in very particular situations. And I would note that the Department of Finance also consults publicly on most amendments before including them in a bill. So to give an example of a technical amendment, Part 3 includes an excise tax measure that clarifies who is eligible to claim a rebate of excise tax for goods purchased by provinces for their own use. There are also a few simplification measures in Parts 3 and 4 to ease tax compliance for business. So for example, Part 3 includes a measure that would raise the income threshold above which financial institutions are required to file a special information return. So this measure is intended to simplify the compliance for smaller financial institutions. And finally, there are a few relieving amendments in Parts 3 and 4 of the bill. So for example, the bill would expand the GST-HST exemption for certain healthcare services to include professional services rendered by psychotherapists and counseling therapists. And it would extend the 100% GST rebate in respect of new purpose-built rental housing to certain cooperative housing corporations. So this concludes a brief description of the type of measures included in Parts 3 and 4 of the bill. And there are a number of officials here who specialize in each of the areas affected by these measures who will be able to explain in more detail if you have any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Riddell. And now we're going to move to members' questions. In the first round, each party will have up to 6 minutes to ask questions. We're starting with MP Lawrence, please.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I just wanted to confirm, pursuant to my earlier point of order, that we have not received notice as to which date the Minister of Finance will be appearing in front of our committee.
So MP Lawrence, I did get some clarification. So as the programming motion clearly reads, that the officials appear within the first week of the pre-study and Minister of Finance to appear the following meeting for not less than 2 hours. So that is what is in the motion.
That's what's in the motion. Would anyone from the government be able to confirm that that the next sitting week that the Minister of Finance will be sitting?
Yeah, well, yeah.
Okay, I would bring the following, I would give notice, not bring, I should say, give notice of the following motion. Out of respect, I'm not going to bring the motion today, but I am going to give notice out of respect to our witnesses, who we do greatly appreciate you being here. And the motion will read as following. The committee not continue any further study of Bill C-59 until we receive confirmation of the date and time of the Minister's Finance appearance for not less than 2 hours. I have copies of it. Circulate them.
Lawrence, you may continue with your questions. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll just leave it up to the officials who they believe is best to answer. My questions will start out with talking about EIFEL, or the restriction on interest allowance there. Since the release of the details on these restrictions, we have received from a number of stakeholders, not the least of them are the Electricity Canada, about the potential impact of these restrictions. One, on their ability to expand and invest the electrical grid, which will be incredibly important if we are to fight climate change. And secondly, that it will produce greater and higher costs for consumers in a time when many Canadians are currently experiencing energy poverty. Could you please address that, and to what extent have you studied the cost on the end user and on the economy?
Yes, I mean, I can say that we've consulted extensively with stakeholders in order to understand the implications of the legislation on specific stakeholders. There are a number of exceptions in the legislation that are intended to sort of deal with more general situations. So we don't have sector-specific exemptions, but we do have an exemption for public-private partnerships that it may be relevant in the situation that you're describing. So there's an exception in that situation where there is a project that is owned by a public authority and the cost of interest is through the arrangement borne by the public authority. So that's typical in a public-private partnership. So yeah, that's something that was done in response to stakeholder comments.
Would you have, or would you be able to provide with our committee any type of studies or documents or materials otherwise that would indicate as to what the impact on the economy and to Canadians would be on the cost of living through the implementation of EIFEL?
I can see what we have.
Okay, I appreciate that. The next area I'm going to talk about is the digital service tax. Want to, first of all, and Mr. Green, you talked a little bit about the initial plan was to go this with the rest of the countries as a multilateral approach. Canada has now taken a unilateral approach and decided to put in the DST, not waiting for our allies. And some commentators have said that this will have negative impacts, both for Canada and for the rest of the world, as now some of the digital giants otherwise will be able to avoid taxation with countries not having their tax codes in lockstep with one another. Could you comment on that, please?
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate the question. It has very much been the government's preference to proceed in this area multilaterally, and have been engaged in these discussions, looking for a common approach since 2017. But the reality is that has proved very elusive. It would certainly be the government's preference to move in that direction. But the government has sort of indicated that it cannot, it doesn't feel it can continue to wait indefinitely. With respect to the U.S., obviously, we pay close attention to to the U.S. reaction in this area. We've been engaged in discussions with the U.S. It is important to note that the U.S. has been explicitly tolerating digital services taxes from 7 countries, including the 3 that I mentioned, since the autumn of 2021. They've recently extended that understanding for another 6 months. And the Deputy Prime Minister has noted that Canada has been engaged in discussion with the U.S. with a view to finding a common understanding in this area.
So so far, the Minister of Finance and others have been unable to negotiate that. What type of Sorry.
Because we're well past 6 minutes,
Oh,
so I just need a very short answer from Mr. Green, if you have an answer to that, and then we're moving on to MP Weiler. You do okay? Yeah. Okay. So MP Weiler, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I also want to thank all our witnesses for being here today. In a moment, I do want to ask some questions on the CCUS tax credit, so I don't know if there's someone that will be joining the table for that. But first, Mr. Green, you mentioned some of the other countries that already have a digital services tax. I was hoping you might be able to mention which countries those are and for how long they've had a similar DST in place.
Well, there are DSTs currently in place in France, the UK, Italy, Spain, Austria, Turkey, India. Most of those were put in place in 2020 or 2021. The Indian tax, I think, is a little bit older. It was 2017 or 18, I think.
That's very helpful. Obviously, we're not the first country to be contemplating one of this, and certainly not even a first mover. So to move over to the carbon capture, utilization, and storage tax credit, I know this is something that's been long in the making, and this is one of probably our first big investment tax credit that we're bringing out, really in response to a lot of the measures in the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. But I do hear from constituents all the time that are concerned about this, because these are one of the main recipients of these tax credits is going to be the oil and gas industry, which is one of the largest, most profitable industries that there are out there. But I know that our tax credit is different than what the United States has brought in. And I was hoping you might be able to speak to how our tax credit treats enhanced oil recovery, which I know in the U.S. is actually where this tax credit is actually used to increase oil production, and what all of the eligible uses are for this tax credit.
I can take that one. Well, to answer the question directly, enhanced oil recovery is not eligible for the investment tax credit for CCUS. From a functional perspective, the way that it works is if your equipment is capturing and storing carbon in eligible uses, which is what you were referring to, and there are 2 of those: geological storage and storage in cement. Then you're eligible for the investment tax credit. And if you are storing in ineligible uses, such as CCUS, then you would be ineligible to the extent that you're storing in one versus the other. And there's essentially a mechanism to determine if there are sort of mixed use projects. Obviously, if one project is all eligible use, then you get the full credit. If it's all ineligible use, then you get none of it. If somehow the project is split, then there are rules that ensure that the part that is dedicated to an ineligible use does not get the credit.
Thank you for that. And one of the other differences with the U.S. tax credit, the 45Q, is theirs is a production tax credit, so it's ongoing, looking at year after year. And ours is different. It's an investment tax credit, so that funding is provided up front. But concerns that I've heard about this tax credit is that carbon capture and storage projects haven't actually met what they've expected to meet over time. And we've had some experience in Canada with, for instance, the Boundary Bay dam project in Saskatchewan, where only about 50% of the carbon was actually captured. And so given that this money is provided upfront in a tax credit, what integrity measures are provided over time to ensure that those targets are actually met, and what impact will that have on the tax credit itself that's advanced to the company?
Well, maybe two ways to answer that. The first, perhaps, just in terms of the process and how you can apply and receive the credit, what is being envisaged there. So effectively, there is a pre-approval process where all proponents that want to access this investment tax credit, all investors have to submit their project plans to the Department of Natural Resources, and then those project plans will be evaluated to determine to what extent, as we were discussing earlier, the project goes to eligible uses versus ineligible, and to what extent the equipment is meeting the requirements in terms of CCUS. And then further to that, as we discussed, there's then a regime to ensure that the credit is apportioned between eligible and ineligible use. And finally, I would say, of course, that given this is a tax program, that the CRA will have a number of controls and verification mechanisms in place, as they do for all other tax programs, to verify that ultimately the investments are being dedicated to their intended use. Of course, if there are not, well, then there is recapture. There are consequences for that.
Weiler, and now to MP Samari.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. First, greetings to all the officials. Thank you for being in attendance today. It's quite awkward that we had to suspend the meeting for about half an hour, and quite annoying. We have a lot of questions and we're going to run out of time, but thank you very much for your attendance, and thank you for the documentation you provided us ahead of time. The 800 pages of C59 is really useful, as well as the other documents you provided, just like the documentation provided by the analysts. It's top quality work and it helps us greatly in our work. I have a lot of questions. I'm going to run out of time, so I'll try and be quick. So if it's tough, it may be tough. So first, will there be any update of the table you provided us to do with your appearance on the 30th of March 2023? Which laid out the $83 billion for environmental credits broken down on a yearly and item basis, and I'd ask you to break it down on a provincial and territorial basis. So if the data have changed vis-à-vis the table you provided us, I'd like you to provide us with an update in writing to the committee in due course. And if you can provide a province-by-province breakdown, it would be much appreciated too. Is that okay? Absolutely, no worries whatsoever. Second question I'd like to broach, completely different now, which has to do with the tax exemption for counselling and therapeutic services.
Now, we're going to suspend for 1 second. I guess we're having some issues with interpretation on the Zoom. So, yeah.
Oui, merci, Mr.
For interrupting.
Merci. Je vais demander au député Blakey.
Thank you. I'll ask Mr. Blakey to stop just annoying me and throwing me off my game. Now, I'm just trying to do a good job of this. Now, the tax exemption for counselling and therapeutic services, there are a lot of psychoeducators in Quebec that have reached out to us asking us whether they would be included in this tax credit. They will get a psychotherapist license And when they do so, well, they're not sure of whether the legislation includes them or not as drafted. So the reference list of this part of the legislation, does it match up with the Social Employment and Social Development Canada table when it comes to psychotherapists, sex therapists, etc., etc.? Can you respond to that question right now? Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to the honourable member for the question. Now, in response to the question, this measure will exempt psychotherapy and counselling services pursuant to the Excise Tax Act and HST-GST provisions. You've asked a specific question about certain categories of persons that fall under the rubric of counselling, psychotherapists, etc. Now, as a rule of thumb, the legislation will be amended to exempt services, and you have the bill before you, the exact wording, psychotherapeutic services. And the CRA and Revenue Quebec are responsible for administrating the HST system and GST system in Quebec, and they will provide guidelines as to the implementation of this measure going forward. Generally speaking, when legislation is enacted, it deals with the broad brushstrokes and general issues and not specific issues. That's the bailiwick. That's left up to CRA and Revenue Quebec, depending on the specific circumstances of the. Thank you very much. That was a very clear answer. And just to make sure I understood correctly, the psychoeducators that are reaching out to us and wondering if they're included in C59, what you could say to them in response is that it will depend on the interpretation of Revenue Quebec's guidelines. Exactly. Spot on. Thank you very much. Next topic. Completely different. The tax credit for investment for clean technology property and zero emissions vehicles. I'd like to know if that applies to the vehicles described under category 56. In Quebec, we have a zero emissions non-road category, for example, pleasure craft and other vehicles that don't have license plates, mining vehicles, etc., etc. Now, under the definition in the bill, will those vehicles be included in the investment tax credit for clean energy? It's not a really comprehensive list in the documentation that's been furnished to us. So I'd like to know if this will be included or not, and if you can't answer immediately, you can submit a written response later.
Je peux peut-être commencer.
Inaudible for the interpreter. Inaudible for the interpreter.
It's inaudible. If you could just maybe move your mic up or closer to you where you're
Sorry
speaking.
about that.
Yes, okay.
Wait.
Let's see if that works.
Yeah.
Yep, go ahead.
So I can repeat it in English.
Yes, please.
I said
Yes.
that it does include Class 56 vehicles, but there's some conditions on that, so we can return in writing with the details.
Je vous remercie beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Third issue. There is a fear that has been shared with us to do with the rules on excessive interest for funding. There are some groups that are engaging in electricity projects that may see their interest deduction reduce. It would hike the costs for consumers if that were to occur. In Part 1A, page 3 of the document that you provided, you state that there are certain requirements for a public-private partnership. What are those requirements exactly? And could you please give us examples of what may be exempt under this change, and also an example that demonstrates how the rules themselves have been changed? Well, I'll take a stab at that question, and I'll respond in English to make sure my answer is clear.
So the definition is set out in the legislation. It requires that you have a project that is owned by a public authority. The interest that is paid has to be borne by the public authority. So that is typically in these kind of arrangements. The cost of the interest is built into the pricing terms. So indirectly, it's borne by the public authority. and the interest has to be paid to a arm's length person, so it can't be just internal interest. There's a rule to allow for situations where there could be like back-to-back interest payments, but ultimately it has to be interest that is being paid to an arm's length person.
Merci beaucoup.
Going to MP Blakey. I want to say just a note to MP Blakey. We got some news yesterday from MP Blakey. I know that you've made a decision. You won't be with us after the end of March, but we and I know you're going to be with us still for 1 week that we have when we come back in March. But we just want to thank you. I want to thank you for all the collaboration, for the contributions that you've made on the many studies here at this committee, and for the last 3.5 years that you've sat here with us. So we thank you very much for that work. And the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. I wanted to follow up on some of the questions about the changes to the EIFEL rules. I know we've also heard from some pension funds that are concerned about what this may mean for certain items in their existing portfolio, and wanted to ask if the department had considered grandfathering existing projects so that there's no retroactive application to investments that have already been made.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly consider that. We've consulted extensively with stakeholders, so there is no grandfathering in the legislation. That's a policy decision. The rules were announced first in Budget 2021, so people have had a significant amount of time to plan and react to the rules. There's also a number of exceptions built into the rules, including exceptions for Canadian businesses and medium and large Canadian businesses that have don't have material non-resident either assets that they own or shareholders. So there's various exceptions that are built in to try to accommodate different situations, but we don't include grandfathering. That would be, it would be quite complicated for one thing, and it would create a lot of other issues.
One of the issues that's come up in relation to the Clean Technology Investment Tax Credit is that where companies are partnering with Indigenous communities to have an equity component, what I'm hearing is that there are some projects that, because the kind of marginal cost advantage once the Clean Technology Investment Tax Credit is in place would favor not having an Indigenous equity partner, because they can't apply the ITC to their own component of the project. That implementing one without implementing the Clean Electricity Investment Tax Credit alongside it actually disincentivizes partnerships with Indigenous governments where there's an equity component. Has the government given consideration to that, and is that something that will be addressed in very short order with legislation for the Clean Electricity Tax Credit?
Take that one. Well, I think you're absolutely right in terms of how you're posing the question, because the Clean Technology Investment Tax Credit is for businesses, and tax-exempt entities are not eligible. It's a tax program. Now, what the government has decided to do, and this is fairly unique, is actually to create a different credit for tax exempts, which include Indigenous communities.
As a part of developing that legislation, is the government considering requests to ensure that Indigenous-owned non-taxable entities would be able to realize a full 30% discount as part of the investment tax credit, so that projects with Indigenous partnerships aren't put at a competitive disadvantage to purely private sector projects when it comes to building clean electricity?
So at this point, it is 15% for the non-taxable. I mean, again, the nature of non-taxable entities, the type we are also talking, you have crown corporations in there, as well. So in that respect, ultimately the decision was to have a lower credit rate. So to get to the mechanics very quickly, the private partner, the business, can claim on their share the 30%, and then the tax exempt on their share can claim the 15%.
I think it's important for the department and for the government to know that there is certainly support in Parliament for seeing Indigenous governments be able to realize a full 30% in order not to disincentivize partnership with Indigenous governments on clean electricity projects. I only have so much time, in more ways than one, Mr. Chair, which is why I'm afraid I'm going to have to move the motion that I gave notice of at the last committee meeting, which is, étant donné que le secteur canadien de l'épicerie a réalisé plus de 6 milliards.
Over $6 billion in 2023, and millions of Canadians have had to deal with food insecurity. Over the course of the year, the Standing Committee on Finance is calling on the government to take immediate action by implementing a tax on excessive profits of grocery store chains that would put money back in the pockets of Canadians in the form of an HST rebate, and establish a national food program for schools, and that this motion be the subject of a report by the House.
Interrupt you there because the bells are going. So, yep, and just
On it, guys.
so. Okay, but he has moved that much. So, are members okay to continue with UC? No, members are not okay to continue. No, but yeah. So the Conservatives don't want to. Cannot continue. So with the bells going, there's a 30-minute bells. Okay, so on that, members, I see the time. We're not going to have any more time, so we are adjourned.